This is the iPhone 15 Pro, and if you're wondering what a hardcore Android enthusiast thinks of this phone, then you've definitely come to the right place. For context, despite being an Android user, every single year I buy one of the latest iPhone models and switch my SIM from whatever Android phone I was using beforehand to the latest iPhone. And I do so for at least a full month to not only see how it compares to the best that Android has to offer, but more importantly, to assess whether it'd be worth considering switching to full time. And let me tell you, this year has been the closest I've come to wanting to switch permanently yet. Let me explain. Okay, so I thought long and hard about this, and for me, I actually think that there are only two key reasons that have contributed to me enjoying the 15 Pro so much, the first of which, surprisingly, has been the design. And I know what you're thinking. How can the 15 Pro's design be that much better given it looks almost identical to last year's 14 Pro? But if you hold both phones side by side, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, whereby the 15 Pro just feels so much nicer in the hand. And in reality, that's really only due to two key changes that Apple made to the side panels: the slightly rounded edges on both the front and the back, and the switch from that glossy stainless steel material that we had on the 14 Pro to now this brushed, matte textured titanium material. They might not sound like big changes, but believe it or not, those two changes alone have made this my new favorite phone design in terms of feel in the hand. I would just highly recommend getting either the natural or white titanium colors because they both have side rails that are in this lighter colorway, which means you can barely see any fingerprints on them at all. Whereas the blue and black variants, they actually still attract quite a lot of fingerprints. But then you turn the phone around to see the display, and the next design change Apple made are to those bezels. And some may argue that this is a very subtle and superficial change, but far out. When I hold the 15 Pro right up against the 14 Pro, man, those bezels on the 14 Pro somehow look huge now. But then the final design change that I am all about is the introduction, finally, of USB-C. And look, there's not much to say here, but as someone who uses USB-C for pretty much every other device in my life, this change was hugely welcome. Now, there is one other design change worth mentioning, which is this new action button, which has come in place of the mute switch. And I got to admit, I thought this was going to be a way more controversial change than it has actually turned out to be, because in reality, I haven't missed that mute switch at all. Now, I've personally left my action button set to trigger the silent and ringer mode, mainly because that's the shortcut that I use the most, but also partly because the positioning of this action button makes it really tricky to reach with one hand, therefore making it something that I don't find myself wanting to do all too often. I will also add that I definitely think it was an oversight on Apple's part not to allow for a wider range of triggers with this action button, like a double or a triple press, for example, which would have made this such a versatile little tool that would have seriously leveled up the phone's functionality. But as we know, for one reason or another, ultimately Apple decided not to add that extra functionality. And I'm not sure if it's possible for them to introduce that in a future software update, but if it is, and they do, then I can definitely see myself making more use of this action button than what I do right now. But aside from that, those other design changes that I mentioned, they are a big part of why I've enjoyed using this phone so much. But reason number two isn't even something Apple did. It's something I did. And that was to fully recreate the setup that I've been using for several years now on my Android phones here on the iPhone 15 Pro. And hats off, I guess, to Apple in a way for even letting this be somewhat of an option with the various customization options that they've added to iOS over the past few years. And if you want to see how I did this, then I'll leave a link to that video up in the cards and down in the description below. But in all honesty, having this home screen layout, which I not only love the look of, but more importantly, that feels very familiar to me, it has actually made me enjoy using the 15 Pro so much more than I would have expected. Now, it's still a bit clunky whereby tapping on each app shortcut still has to open the Widget app first before then launching the app of choice, which I definitely thought would not have been something we'd have to deal with thanks to the introduction of interactive widgets with iOS 17. But alas, in true Apple style, that's still not actually possible. But even with that slight clunkiness, it still made using this phone so much more enjoyable for me. But here's what's funny. Those two changes are really the only changes that I noticed when comparing the iPhone 15 Pro to last year's iPhone 14 Pro. And as I said, I'm responsible for one of those changes. Like, the software is virtually the exact same, with pretty much all of the new iOS 17 features getting ported back to the iPhone 14 Pro, and a lot of them also to older devices as well. The phone's haptics are identical, as is the Face ID functionality. And even though technically the phone has an upgraded chip inside, as far as I'm concerned, the iPhone 15 Pro's performance feels the exact same as the 14 Pro, which is to say it's really, really impressive and handles anything I throw at it with absolute ease. Oh, and side note, I've not experienced any of those overheating or heavy battery drain issues with my unit, although apparently those were mostly addressed with the recent 17.0.3 software update anyway. But thought I'd mention it in case you were interested. And speaking of battery, whilst technically the battery inside this phone is fractionally bigger than last year's 14 Pro, unfortunately, at least for me, that hasn't translated to much of an improvement with battery life. Now, the 17.0.3 software update definitely seems to have improved things a bit, but even with that being the case, it's still not back to those ridiculous levels that we saw with the 13 Pro series 2 years ago. I mean, even the display is the exact same, with the same max brightness and that same 120Hz refresh rate. Don't get me wrong, it is a fantastic display, still one of the best on the market, but as I said, it's just the same as the one found on the 14 Pro. Oh, and whilst we're talking about the display, I will just mention that whilst I appreciate that Apple's use of ceramic shield is supposed to make the glass more resistant to full-on shatters if dropped, the downside of that is that it actually seems to make the glass way more susceptible to getting those super annoying micro scratches. I mean, I didn't drop or place my iPhone 14 Pro last year face down onto any surface, yet it still got a bunch of these micro scratches, which I just couldn't unsee. And so if you are picking up one of these new super expensive phones for yourself, then I highly recommend at the very least getting yourself a high quality screen protector straight from the jump, just to keep that front glass in pristine condition. I've actually been using this Impact HD screen protector from channel sponsor Casetify since day dot, which has kept my iPhone 15 Pro's display in top shelf condition. And what's amazing is that it's so well designed that I don't even notice it on the phone. But if you want to truly protect your new phone, then you should also seriously consider picking up one of their incredible cases. And what I love about their cases is that you get to decide how much protection you want. You've got the sleeker cases, but then you can choose to go all the way with their Ultra Bounce case, which offers, you ready for this? 10 times the level of military grade protection. That means it's protected against drops of up to 32.8 feet, and it does this through a combination of their high quality EcoShock material, its 6 built-in layers of defense, as well as this unique twister design on the corners, all of which absorb and distribute impact forces evenly. You can also still customize any of their cases if you like, including changing the base color or even adding personal touches. So to keep your phone protected in style, head to my link, casetify.com/Sam Beckman, to get a very handy discount on your Casetify order. Okay, real quick, whilst there aren't technically any hardware changes to the cameras on this phone either, there are actually a few software related camera changes that some of you may or may not appreciate, so I thought I'd mention them briefly before moving on. Firstly, images from the main lens are now captured in a higher 24 megapixel resolution by default. Now for me, that's not really something I take advantage of or even notice if I'm being honest, but I can definitely see why others might appreciate that. Then on top of the very cool 2x sensor cropping trick that they introduced last year, which most other manufacturers have since ported over to their own phones, Apple have also now introduced 2 more crop modes, a 1.2x crop and a 1.5x crop. And I think a lot of people assume that this is just some sort of digital zoom trickery. However, let me stress that that is definitely not the case. You see, because images are spat out at 24 megapixels, despite the fact that the main camera is actually using a larger 48 megapixel sensor, Apple is actually able to crop into that sensor without needing to zoom in digitally, all while still spitting out a 24 megapixel image. If you're familiar with mirrorless cameras at all, it's similar to that APS-C mode that you might find on a full frame mirrorless camera, which I can attest to is absolutely not just a digitally zoomed in shot. Now, as well as that, you do also get the option now of turning regular photos into portrait mode shots after the fact, which is definitely a nice feature to have. You also have the option to shoot in a log color profile when shooting video using Apple's ProRes format, which is seriously cool, though again, not a feature I can see myself using all too often, if at all. Plus, there are some other small changes that have been sprinkled throughout as well. And like I said, some of you may appreciate these changes more than others, but as far as I'm concerned, the camera shooting experience still feels almost identical to the 14 Pro. And don't get it twisted, that's definitely not a bad thing. I mean, it feels like Apple are already at the peak in terms of what smartphone cameras can achieve. But if we're talking tangible changes over last year's 14 Pro for the common user, then this really isn't a category I'd say has gotten noticeably better. Plus, it feels like Apple could port these new software features back to the 14 Pro if they really wanted to, but my guess is that they probably won't. And so, despite seemingly very little upgrades to this phone over the 14 Pro, like I've alluded to throughout, this has actually still been my favorite iPhone to use ever. Like, normally as soon as I've finished reviewing an iPhone, I switch my SIM card back to an Android phone as quickly as possible. But with this phone, I think I can even go as far as to say that I'll actually be a little sad to stop using it. Now, with that being said, until Apple pretty much fully replicates Android's notification system with icons in the status bar and unread notifications that don't disappear from the lock screen until I've manually dismissed them, plus until they give us true interactive widgets that let us launch app shortcuts from widgets without having to open up another app first, and until they can give me an alphabetized app drawer, I don't think I could permanently switch to using an iPhone. But if they did introduce those features, gee, it'd be a much, much tougher choice. But here's the thing that's important to highlight before we finish, which is that at this price point, in terms of the Android versus iOS debate, it really is a toss-up. You can buy an iPhone and be super happy with it, or you could buy an Android phone and be equally as happy with it. The issue that I see happening is that a lot of people assume that Android phones are just out and out cheaper than iPhones, and so they spend like $300 on something like a Samsung Galaxy M54, which is a budget phone through and through, and then they complain when it's nowhere near as good as a $1,000 iPhone. I mean, of course it's not going to be as good. But if you spent $1,000 on an Android phone, then I would argue that most people would actually really enjoy the experience. The issue is that hardly anyone is willing to make the switch, which I totally get. Now, I don't deny that there was a period a long time ago where iPhones were the better premium phones to get and Androids were the ones to get if you wanted to save money. But as far as I'm concerned, we now thankfully live in a time where if you are looking to invest in a premium smartphone, then whether you decide to go with an iPhone or an Android phone, both are really, really great options. And at that point, it really comes down to which OS you prefer. It just so happens that I prefer Android right now, but who knows? That could definitely change in the future, and I'd be lying if I said that that didn't kind of scare me.